Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Curl and I am a proud member of the 20 under 35 cohort, one of the 20 people under 35 who the industry has named as a future leader. We are proud, along with SES, to be a sponsor of this new special series of the Better Satellite World called Space for All. And now here is the host of our series, Lou Zaccarella.
Hello, everyone. One of the best developments underway in our industry is that we now have philosophers, people who think and write about what we are in the big picture. And that is what the Better Satellite World concept was really all about. So today we're going to stay right with it. But first, the Better Satellite World is supported by the corporate partners of SSPI, Eutelsat, EchoStar Hughes, Peraton, and Access Intelligence, content with context. Additional support comes from the 3,000 professional members of SSPI and our chapters around the world. Well, in a now legendary interview with New York journalist and critic Mark Deary, the term Afrofuturism was attributed. The purpose was to identify and begin to weave into the tissue of culture overall, quote, speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, and more generally, African American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. So if there is an Afrofuturism, it must be sought in unlikely places, constellated from far-flung points. Well, certainly the space and satellite industry is one of those points and places where the shape of Afrofuturism can morph into another tool to make our collaborative journey to space different, to make it more humane and ethical and reflective of the common good that really has at its core, as we've been talking about, absolute spiritual and emotional truths. So we are hearing new voices speak to an old truth. Tech can only get us up, but it cannot sustain us or fulfill the joy we sense is in our exploration to that place out there. One of those striking new voices is Ytasha Womack, author, Afrofuturist, and director. Her book, Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, in 2013, is a leading primer on the subject, which bridges sci-fi, futurism, and culture. So let's see if we can add commercial space to that bridge. Ytasha is an inaugural author with Megascope, an imprint dedicated to speculative fiction and comics. Her graphic novel epic, Black Cube, illustrated by Tana Tucker, will debut in 2022. She tours the world, championing the idea and the role of the imagination. So her tour stopped right here today at the Better Satellite World, and we're delighted to have her. Hi, Ytasha.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, now that we've got you. I appreciate you coming by. Now, I gave a pretty long and common definition, I guess, of Afrofuturism. It's about unleashing the power of the imagination. But before I ask you specifically what it is, in your view, I was listening to your talk at Sonic X over in Holland. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. And I was really struck by the story you told about how you got 10-year-olds who imagined a future without things, like gun violence, into thinking about things like space travel. It was remarkable how you entered their core of hope by talking about things like music and explaining imagination to them. So you said imagine yourself into the future creates agency. And so I have to ask as the first question, is imagination the primary tool for you? Is that the basic color on your palette?
I would say so. And this intersection of the imagination and visioning is certainly one that I champion, but I've also found it to be a core philosophical modality in the sense that imagining beyond your circumstance is always going to push you to new heights as an individual and as a collective.
Mm-hmm. Imagination is really what we've been about, at least on the technical side. So, explain what Afrofuturism is and to connect the dots here, what its role might be in today's commercial space and satellite community, which is obviously more and more poised toward going out into space.
Sure. Well, Afrofuturism is a way of looking at the future or alternate realities, but through a Black cultural lens. And when I say Black culture, I'm referring not just to African American culture, but Black people on the continent of Africa and the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and elsewhere. And it's an artistic aesthetic in one sense, in that you see it in music, you see it in film. You think about a film like Black Panther. If you're into jazz or funk, you can think about, say, Parliament Funkadelic and a lot of that space imagery.
Oh yeah, wow, yeah.
But it's also a way of looking at the world, an epistemology, and it's a method for helping people to push past issues they may have with the imagination in particular, because sometimes people aren't encouraged to imagine beyond where they are, but doing so is really a lifeline, and it's the foundation for resilience, particularly when people are in tough circumstances.
Yeah.
So when I talk about Afrofuturism, I talk about it as an intersection of Black cultures, the imagination, liberation, technology, and mysticism. And in that, it just makes it a little different between maybe some takes on futures or even science fiction, because it values the divine feminine. It values the realm of intuition in the same way that it values our logic or thinking nature. Afrofuturism looks at mysticism and technology as being flip sides of the same coin. And it also recognizes that time is nonlinear. So we're not just moving in one direction. The future, the past, and present can very much be one.
Right. And there's a lot there. I mean, there's a lot of tools there that, again, to bring it back to our industry, that we haven't accessed completely, but that we're going to need to, because they're a part of the human experience, and given the unique the cultural reference, could be of tremendous value as we go out and build ourselves into space. And I want to get into that a little bit later. But just I want to talk a bit about you. Where did your views evolve from? I know your family was part of the Great Migration, but was there an overview effect moment for you, or has this been a process or reflection of self-discovery, writing, and discussion, where you finally arrived at a very clear point and said, I am, part of the power that's going to, be the future?
Well, it's interesting. I'm a person who feels like, upon hearing the term Afrofuturism, I realized that I was an Afrofuturist, and had been one my entire life. And, but it was really a moment I had when I was in college at Clark Atlanta University, where, just a couple weeks into school, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was talking about, quantum physics and futures and hip hop culture and social change, and really interweaving these in ways that I understood and I connected with. And I distinctly remember asking him, what is this? What is, what's the ground floor for this conversation? Meaning, what's the philosophy? What do you call it? And I'll never forget this. He literally said, I don't know. And
It's a good place to start, right?
Right. And I asked, and so I referenced some metaphysics books that I had read, because I came up in a philosophy that emphasized metaphysics. And he had read some of those same books. And, and from there, we continued our conversation. But the entire campus of the Atlanta University Center, with Morehouse and Spelman and Morris Brown, Clark Atlanta at the time, were really into Afrofuturist ideas, whether they were talking about social change or whether they were, exploring it creatively. But then after college, like many people, unless you're literally pursuing the arts, what do you do with these ideas?
Yeah.
How do you build upon them? And so years later, when a person I knew told me that they were teaching Afrofuturism and they explained it, I was a little frustrated because I knew so many people who identified with these ideas, but they felt like they were on the margins or a little alienated because they didn't know there was a term to contextualize what they were discussing.
Mm-hmm.
They felt alone. They felt, like you couldn't have conversations with certain people bringing up these ideas. And just to know that there was a term and, academic writing on the subject really could have helped people who were working with these concepts sort of flesh out or build
Right.
upon these contemplations. So that was part of my motivation for writing the book. And in doing so, I had this moment, and maybe this was part of my overview effect moment. I had a story idea in the midst of writing this book on Afrofuturism about a character who lived on a planet 200 years into the future. And she was third generation on this planet. Her name was Rayla, and there was a utopian world that it turned upside down. And I wanted to really talk about this experience of how someone could be three generations deep on another world that they're trying to restore, and what that connection is, what connection they have to not just Earth but to culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in so doing, I became so excited about that story. I wrote that story in the middle of writing the Afrofuturism book, then I had to launch the book as an ebook, and then went and finished the Afrofuturism book itself. And for me, that was a very intrinsic experience of recognizing that these contemplations of life and space are not just grounding, but they change us in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And we're very much connected to histories and futures. And in this storytelling process, I really was able to feel that deep connection in a very multifaceted way.
Yeah. And it goes to show two things. I mean, we are, creatures of our imagination. And are we even close to having a process or authority or permission to go out and do that? And if so, how do we unlock it? Or if not, I should say, how do we unlock it?
Well, I think some of us are doing it, and some of us maybe not so much. We forget that the homes we live in are an offshoot of design. The
Mm-hmm.
cities we live in are an offshoot of design. The objects that we use are an offshoot of design. And these design elements are a reflection of a philosophy around how you should live and how you should engage with the world. So we can be very socialized into a particular lens of seeing the world, not realizing that it's a lens
Right, right,
that's being reinforced with the things that we see around us.
right.
And
And you, go ahead, please.
and I just feel like this imaginatory process, for those of us who don't realize that we're looking through a lens, helps us to push past that to say, oh, wait a minute, there's one lens, and look, here's another one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. What do I want to shape and craft? And allowing these things that we read and engage with to shape and inform us. Sometimes I think there's a fear with that, particularly when people are looking into the arts. If they don't think of themselves as quote unquote art people, um, allowing the not just the contemplation of the process, but actually creating something themselves, allowing that to change their perspective, which then ultimately would change how they live their lives. There's a fear of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it takes a certain type of courage. In many cases, it also takes having gone through a crucible of some kind. Do you think that, for example, the African diaspora can be used in a positive way to get us into the right sense of imagination, so that we can build policies that prevent us from making those mistakes, but give us the kind of access we're going to need to collaborate as one human species when we go out into space.
Well, I certainly think there's a lot of valuable lessons, wisdom, and insight from these experiences that people in the African continent, the diaspora, have had. And whether that's because of the tensions around inequality and how people were able to navigate and survive that, or whether it's just literally the perspectives on the world that have existed in spite of that. There are a lot of insights around philosophically around science and technology and design and ways of living that come from these experiences that, sometimes have been, referenced and pulled from liberally, but maybe not always highlighted as being coming from, say, the African diaspora and the continent. And then in another sense, there's other perspectives that just aren't really being engaged in the whole. And so I think in writing the book, Rayla 2212, which I wrote in the midst of writing this nonfiction book on Afrofuturism, I realized that, culture and thinking on culture as we're going into these spaces is really important.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what we've been talking to folks like yourself, Frank White, and others about what that culture is going to look like. Hey, who are your role models?
It's so funny. I
I
mean,
wanted to
of
ask you
course,
that.
my parents, I have to thank them because they were always encouraging the use of the imagination and value history. But we're also very forward thinking, of course. But there's other people who I just like, I mean, I always like Debbie Allen. She's a choreographer, dancer,
Sure.
director, just because she's so multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
I was always kind of excited about Mae Jemison, Dr. Mae Jemison, who is an astronaut, but also a jazz aficionado. She's a choreographer,
That's right.
and a scientist, and so I find myself always intrigued by the multi-hyphenates of the world.
Yeah, right. Well, you're one of them, right? Yeah, I noticed that.
It would explain some things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Explain your bio. This is what we're also leading to with this series is we call it Space for All. Our executive producer, Tamara Bond Williams, who I think named this. And it's about access, right? It's about developing and not making the same mistakes, right? I mean, we've gone through our evolution here in the world. We kind of know where the fault lines tend to be. So we've got that experience. So now when we talk about access, we're just at the beginning of, as I said, developing a philosophy, policies, the technologies, all of the things that are going to create that new culture that are going to get us out there and have people living for 3 generations on a planet, not just in their imagination. What would you say are the 1 or 2 primary mistakes that we can avoid pretty easily when it comes to diversity of access right now, right here?
Well, I think one mistake that is made is that we aren't listening to people. And sometimes that's a reflection of either not seeing someone or not wanting to see them, or just assuming you already know who they are and what they're going to be saying. So there's not this listening to understand or this listening with empathy. There's, a listening to like pass the time and get to a point.
Yeah, yeah.
So that would be one.
And you can, by the way, you can tell when a person's going there because you can feel it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you mean tell when someone's not listening to you?
Yeah, and when they're just trying to get to the end of a point, right? That they're finishing your sentences for you, or it's what Frank Zappa used to call pajama people.
Right.
To
Or,
kind of
you know, when someone expects you to say one thing and you don't say what they expect,
right,
of course,
right,
you don't know they had an expectation of what you should be saying. And then there's just, you know, this deer in headlight look
right.
because it's what you're saying is not adding up with their expectation.
Hmm.
Um, and so listening, I would say one. Two, I think another mistake that's made is that there's a like a hierarchy of experiences, as if some experiences are more valuable than others.
Mm.
And granted, you know, some skill sets might be more applicable to a given situation than another, which could give it more value in the moment. But I don't think there's a hierarchy of experiences.
Right.
And so I think that's something to really contemplate. And I think another mistake that we make, and I'm starting to realize that all of these things I'm saying are a little intertwined. I feel like there sometimes there's this idea that as an individual you're not a part of a collective.
Mm. Yeah.
And you know, granted, you have to have there is the element of self-actualization which has to exist, but you don't exist apart from other human beings.
Right.
We're still intertwined, influencing one another, whether you like that or not. And I think that that's really kind of important. So that then sort of dovetails into this whole idea of otherizing people
Hmm.
um, for any set of reasons. And that I think is something that, you know, many people have to sort of push past.
Right. But you know, does that require a common goal, a common, yeah, a common sense of protection of one another? I mean, the reason I like the space and satellite industry is because it's very collaborative. We have to be collaborative. You build a rocket the wrong way, it's going to blow up. You get out into space, and whether you're Russian or Japanese or American or whatever, you don't get it right on the space station. There's nothing out there. You really have to look out for one another. Um, you know that, and every religion teaches that, right? Every parent teaches that. You know, have a sense of selfless regard, and you'll be a lot happier. You'll be a lot more powerful, right? The last shall be first. But how does that get accomplished on a collective basis going forward? And because I asked you, where can we start on that? Listening for sure. The idea of hierarchy, well, that's going to probably be a little tougher to deal with. But how do we use our imagination for that third one?
Well, I don't know if it's so much about the imagination, but it becomes about just the doing. Um, you know, one of the things you mentioned, you were saying that the thought is if you're working towards a common goal, you put everything aside to work towards this goal, right?
Hmm.
And that would make people, you know, stop paying attention to their differences.
Hmm.
But we can't always be dependent upon these emergencies to
Right,
facilitate
right.
that kind of collectivism.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we can't always be worried about something blowing up. So therefore, right? I mean, that gets
Right.
exhausting. Yeah.
Because we've seen that too, where everyone puts everything aside to achieve the big goal, then the goal's achieved, and then people go back to their little corners of the universe again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Uh,
that's you define politics.
yeah, so I think it becomes a practice of valuing people and valuing our relationship to the earth and valuing our relationship to one another, and really thinking about humanity
Hmm.
and and I guess that can maybe be imaginatory to a point. But there's a lot of internal work that comes with that, you know, sort
Yes.
of working
Yes.
with your own biases, the things you're projecting upon other people. I mean, there's a lot of internal work with that as we're having this sort of collective space.
Yep, amen. I think we're going to end it right there, Ytasha, because we're out of time. And I know you've got like a million things to do, like your Black Cube project and others. So I really want to thank you for coming by. I hope we can do this again. Would that be okay if we reached out to you?
Oh, absolutely. It's been fantastic sharing with you. And I just think it's so important that all of us think more about space and collectivism and how we can be, better human beings here on Earth.
I would absolutely agree on that. Well, listen, thanks again and best of luck going forward. That concludes my visit with Ytasha Womack. So many thanks again to her. Thanks to our corporate members and the members of SSPI and our chapters. SSPI makes leaders, and you just heard one. It is the world's largest nonprofit trade association for professionals and students whose life, work, study, or interests touch the commercial space and satellite industry. On December 7th, don't forget, SSPI and UK and Isle of Man chapters will host the annual Better Satellite World Awards dinner. Tickets are available at sspi.org. To learn more about our Better Satellite World narrative and to hear more podcasts like this one with Ytasha Womack, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. And if you're not a member of SSPI and would like to know more, again, go to sspi.org. Student memberships are free. And follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care.